Hi, everyone, and thank you for attending the Postman webinar. Today, we'll be talking about running collections. Previously, we spoke about tests and scripts, and there'll be a little bit of continuation on that here. So let's go ahead and just take a peek back into, sorry, one second. Always with the Chrome errors. There we go. So we're just going to look at the workshop webinar page real quick. We'll post that up in Zoom for you. But this is a place where you can go to register for the next webinars as always. After we talk about running collections today, we'll be talking about communication next session, which is covering things like publishing documentation, looking at activity feeds, and most importantly, managing workspaces and sharing information between them. That will be a great piece of information if you work on teams, and I really encourage you to check that next session out. Today, however, we will be talking about running collections. So we've mentioned that a few times over the course of our different webinars. This is a talk originally given by Joyce Lynn. She is another one of our deaf evangelists and very fantastic. So today we'll just be walking through some of the stuff we covered in the workshop as always. So what is the reasoning for running a collection? We've worked with building collections before. We've worked with structuring them, seeing how we can automate them, seeing how we compare them with environments. But the one thing we haven't worked with yet is seeing how we can take all of that and scale it up so that it's active on this massive, huge scale that we weren't able to accomplish just with clicking before. When we run collections, we can do things like mirror our workflow, like what we saw last time when we tweeted about the weather. We can replicate a user experience, walk through getting a piece of information and carrying it to somewhere else. And we can test for 100 different scenarios. So many different facets that otherwise would be extremely difficult to run through with an individual just manually searching are suddenly possible when we start running collections. So there are 3 ways to run a collection within Postman. We can run them through the Postman app in the Collection Runner. We can run them in the command line from Newman, and we can run them in the cloud with Postman monitoring. We'll be covering all of them today. And oftentimes, your most basic use as an individual will be in the app. Once you move into a team that's doing some distributed testing, you might be working in the cloud with monitors. And if you're building something out of your CI/CD pipeline, basically doing anything DevOps, you would probably end up using Newman. So let's move forward. We're going to talk about running your collections in the app now. Let's go ahead and step into the app. And, we're going to look at tests and scripts, this collection that we put together last time. If you'll recall, this was just a pretty simple Twitter status response. We were calling the Twitter API and testing to see whether or not we got a 200 code or whether or not we got a 201 code. So these tests will never run the same. We were looking to see if the responses contain certain text. We were looking to looking at content types for headers and the response times. And lastly, we're using that TV4 library to do some or JSON validation. So we individually ran each of these tests last time, and we were able to see them pass or fail. Like here we see, our 201 failed. But, say we have hundreds of different accounts and environments and things like that to run in. We might actually want to do that faster. So how can we go about running things on a more automated and larger scale? Well, when we click this triangle next to in the collection icon, we can see this run button. And so the run button here actually will open a separate window in the Postman app. And this is called the Collection Runner. The Collection Runner is going to be one of your best friends once you start working with collections. So what we're able to do here is we're actually able to, even independently of what we're working on right now, we're able to walk through all of our different collections. But we were looking at testing scripts, and we are able to select subfolders if we want, or the entire collection. In this case, we were just looking at our test folder, so let's go in there. What I've done now is I've selected all of the requests within the test folder to run programmatically. So as you see here, I'm also able to select an environment, and you do have access to all the environments that you have currently set up. There's also the ability to select an iteration count. So this will determine how many times you repeat your basically your collection run. You can set this from 1 to up to very high numbers. In this case, let's set it to 3. We're going to run through this 3 times, and then you can also set a delay to exist between the collections as they run. When we talked about simulating simulating your workflows or simulating actual user behavior, these iterations and delays are really good ways of doing that. For example, if you have some sort of API that's serving a front end, you might want to see the behavior of someone who's constantly refreshing your site. And that would be a good way to use these iterations as well as delays to start seeing some actual user behavior. Here you see logging responses. This is something that's pretty standard. These things will, in the same way that we've been using the console log in the past, it'll send those to the console. This data is actually something we'll talk about in just a little bit, but the Collection Runner has a very powerful feature in which we're able to use different data files like CSVs to actually step through a collection and treat each line of the CSV like a different environment. And this final checkbox is persisting variables. So what persisting variables will do is when you run the collection normally, you'll basically save a copy of your environment, and then as you're running, the collection will be able to manipulate and change that. Your environment will be mutable for the time that Collection Runner is working. But after you're finished with your collection run, you will actually see no change in the environment unless you decide to persist your variables. This might not make a lot of sense as to why it matters right now, but I'm going to show you an example of another flow in a little bit that shows why it's important. So here we go. Let's go ahead and run our tests. So look at this. So we've run everything 3 times, and we can see that these 2 tests have failed. So what exactly is going on here? We knew that these 2 tests were going to fail from our work last time, and this is behaving as expected. We know that we can actually call the Twitter API 3 times right in a row, and it is performant. This sort of gets into the idea of maybe stress testing your API. If you're running it on a home server and you want to see how many times it can stand up to hundreds of cascading calls, that might be a good thing to check it out with the Collection Runner. We have these little icons on the side which allow us to see the passes individually and the fails individually. So these are very helpful, especially for when you have extremely complex collections and you need to know exactly which request, which endpoint failed. You are able to export these results as a JSON file, and you're also able to see this run summary page, which allows you to see sort of each iteration when you're stepping through what was failing and what was passing. So if you are, say, iterating over an environment or expecting something to fail over time as you hit it more and more, this can be a really good way to see the point at which something starts to break. So also you have the ability to retry and run something right over again. Oh, also there's a quick access menu right on the side here that will skip you to a certain iteration. If you retry, it runs everything over again just as you saw it, and then you can always hit new to go back to the original page. So that is a quick overview of the collection runner. If you have any immediate questions as to what we're doing here or something that you might be interested in seeing a little bit more, go ahead and throw them up in the chat. I'm going to start moving through just a little bit forward, and maybe some of those questions will be answered before you knew that you were going to ask them. So as we were seeing, we can use to test for all of these scenarios. When we say we can use it to initialize the database, that's the data files that we'll go over in just a second. We can streamline and set up teardown for testing. So that is something like what we saw with setting up these environments, setting up these iterations and delays, and deciding how many times we're going to repeat. And then we can change the sequential and dynamic order. That is something that we didn't get to see yet. So what we'll go over in just a second when we change that sequential and dynamic order is a flow. So we have a question right now saying, will delay from run collection be the delay between the collection or each request within the collection? So the delay is actually the delay that, and I believe, is the delay between each iteration of the collection. Currently, the collection will happen basically one after the other, but if you decide to run a large amount of iterations, you can delay between them. So, awesome, thank you. So the collection runner, oh yes, so we were just talking about running in sequential and dynamic order. What we're going to see in just a second is an example of not a testing-oriented collection run, but also a functional-oriented collection run, sort of like the flow that we played with last time with the footer and the weather. I went ahead and walked you through all of these different results, the GUI for the collection runner, and I'll just allow you to see those stored requests and response. And you also, one thing I did fail to show you, and I'll just pop in and show you that real quick, is the filtering, which will allow you to basically see specific things. So if you do want to see like, hey, did this specific request fail? You are able to go in and filter. Sorry, oops. So if we were looking in the runner itself, you do have this filtering option up in the upper right corner before you go to run your actual collection. So, oops. Yep. So one thing that we are not going to demo today, but we're going to talk through, and there are a few videos on our YouTube channel that can help you see this, is walking through a CSV or JSON file. And as I was talking about earlier, you can actually treat different lines of a CSV file with a collection runner like an environment. So as you see on the side here, if you just imported a CSV with city and ramen, or whatever data you might have in your separate columns, you could then use this pm.iteration data in your sandbox to assert those values. And then in other areas, such as in your requests, you would be able to actually use the variable name that you've assigned there, like city or ramen, to access that information. And again, the way that you are accessing that is with that data file that we saw loading. So as we were talking about, you can also share those collection runs. If I can find where my collection runner got to, here we go. So one second. Yep. So we can export those results like we were talking about. And then real quick, we're actually going to snap back, and I'm going to show you a small example of one of those functional collection runs that we were talking about. So real quick, here we have an example of the Informatica API. What this API does is it actually allows you to submit text that describes symptoms, and then you are able to iterate through, or basically send in that text, and it'll give you diagnoses. So here we go. we can see what we're sending in. We're saying, oh, my head hurts, my feet are numb, I can't taste anything, my stomach is upset, my throat hurts, I feel anxious and woozy. And we go ahead and send that, and it actually breaks down all of those symptoms from natural text. Now, we also want to be able to not just get those, but tell our users in the end what specifically they are going to be feeling, what they're going to be getting. We want to give them a report. So we're going to look for our report here. And in order to do that, we actually need to go and get the specific information on these symptoms that we're being returned to here. We have another API to go do that, which goes and gets that information for those. And then we have our final call, which after getting the information on those systems, calls, gets the condition, and then we'll assemble those all into our report. So if we were to run these individually, we'd have to click through for each individual symptom that we are expressing. But instead, we can actually go and run this. And let's go ahead to make sure. So one important thing to remember is that if you don't click into a folder that you specifically want to run, it will literally run everything in the collection. And this is important to remember for descriptive collections. So we had a question if we see error messages for failed requests within the collection. That is something where you actually want to also include the Postman console. Let's see if that will pop up real quick. Looks like my console is not wanting to respond. Okay. So let's go ahead and run this real quick, and then we can talk about those error messages. So we're going to go ahead and run this. Oh, and we see it's running, and actually there's one thing I've forgotten to do, so we're not going to see a report right here. And if anyone can guess what I forgot to do, you know, there's definitely a special prize, but I'll give you a few seconds. There is a checkbox that we forgot to check. So if you said persist variables, you were correct. Looks like I've forgotten to persist my variables. And yep, we had a good answer there in the chat. So when we persist our variables, like I said, once again, we are able to actually run and get all of the information that we saw in the end. So let's go ahead and run this again now that we are persisting our variables. Awesome. So now we see that we have a report. You know, we might be experiencing lactose intolerance. It's condition moderate in prevalence and mild in severity. And it's broken down into all these different symptoms. And if you see, that is a good way to for all of these different conditions with these 4 symptoms that can be possible. Now we have basically done the combination to see all of those different conditions and deliver a report for them. So this is functionality that would have been extremely difficult to accomplish just clicking through. And so we've really expanded the abilities that we have of what to do with, or what we can do with Postman by using Collection Runner. And let's get back to that question real quick about errors, and we'll go ahead and throw an error here in one of our scripts. So there we see that that's erroring out. Let's retry this. Oh, sorry, you also need to save. So like this says, you need to check DevTools for more information. So definitely go ahead and look at your console there. I don't know what's keeping my console from popping up right now. Maybe it's something to do with the app, but that is where you're going to look, is in your developer console. So if you need more in-depth information on why your JavaScript sandbox, the scripts that you've created are failing, the Collection Runner will only give it to you to a certain level. So I'll pause for a second and allow you guys to ask any questions you might have about the Collection Runner. Give you guys about 15, 20 seconds, and then we're going to go ahead and move on to running our collections within the cloud. So we did have a question about the data file. That's one thing, oops, excuse me. That's one thing I will direct you guys to the YouTube channel for, since we don't quite have it set up for today's webinar, but that is something we could look into doing later, or shoot me a tweet, and we can go ahead and see about maybe setting up a separate thing. But when we do look at Collection Runner, we can just highlight, sorry. We can highlight the this data file. So here we go. You select a file, and if you happen to have the CSV, you will be able to load it, and then you can select your deck. You can select the different data file that you're looking in, and then preview what it's looking like, and see as you can see here that this is a list of the Postman issues in GitHub. So if we were to start a collection that would put that into an API, this can be helpful for running through that. Okay. So we had a question about whether or not there is a persist variable like feature in Newman Runner. And we will actually call out the Postman API in combination with Newman and a little bit later, but that's something that we will be talking about later on in today's webinar. So we also had another question about sequential or dynamic. So the difference between sequential and dynamic is interesting. So as we saw before, when we were looking at these tests and scripts, where did that collection go? Here we are. When we look at the tests and scripts, we ran each one after the other, right? But as you saw, when we were doing this specific example, there are only 3 requests here. But when we look at our collection runner, there are, oops, sorry, that was our error one. Let's go back there. There are literally hundreds of, or not hundreds, but there are a lot of repeated requests. How did we happen to go and repeatedly send the same requests over and over again? So this is a really great question. I want to thank Steve for asking this because it's important to call out. And this gets into something that is an important part of doing sequential and basically functional collection running rather than testing collection running, which is the set next request feature. So here we see that how do I know to stop sending requests when I'm repeatedly looping through that list of conditions, these diagnoses that get populated when I actually run this engine. So if you see, when I run that, we end up with a list of diagnoses, and then we have an empty report. So how do we get from the list of diagnoses to the report? And we'll see, let's go ahead and send this request once. So when we go ahead and send this request, our list of diagnoses has actually gotten one shorter, and we've added a report to the reporting variable in the environment. How did that happen? What we're actually doing is we're taking one of those diagnoses lists, we're taking that variable and turning it with JSON.parse, what we saw in scripting earlier in the last session, and turning that into a JavaScript object, basically with JSON.parse, taking one of those, the items from that object and calling it within this specific request. So if we were to keep on doing this, we would see that more and more reports would be generated, and there would be fewer and fewer conditions that would show up here in this diagnosis list. When we do this in Collection Runner, we automate it by using this set next request feature. And this is where dynamic running comes in. So if you see here, I'm checking if our diagnosis list is empty, because I know that if the list is empty, I don't want to send any more requests because that will cause an error. So I say, if it's empty, or if it's not empty, then we will set next request to make report, which is the request that we're currently using. You can use any request name here within your collection. So I could go ahead and call, query diagnostic engine copy or find mentions of observation. in given text copy. But here, what I've done is actually setting up a basic programming construct called a loop. So I am looping through our diagnosis list, and I am creating reports from it. At the end, when our diagnosis list is empty, I use postman.setNextRequest null. And what this does is it makes it so that the next request that the runner wants to run is empty, effectively telling it that it's done, there's no more requests to run. Even if there are requests that occur after this in the collection, this will still go ahead and end the run. So there are a few important caveats to know here, which is even if you set the next request, but you do not set anything to null, the collection runner will continue running things sequentially. Its job is to go through each request in a collection or a folder and run them one after another. When we go ahead and add this dynamic functionality in, we are sort of playing with the job that the collection runner likes to do. So it's important to realize that it's still going to try and do its primary function no matter how we do permute that. So if we were to set our next request somewhere up here, it would continue iterating down again. That's an important thing to understand and why we actually set our next request to null. So knowing all of this, let's go ahead and run our collection again. And as we see, we're calling this make report over and over and over again using that set next request functionality. Basically dynamic chaining is one of the most awesome things that you can do in a Postman request. It lets you simulate user behavior because sometimes your users are going to get one response and they're going to decide to do something completely different than they would have with another one. This allows you to create chains or branching trees of different requests that simulate different testing flows or different functionality within your API. This is something that I personally love to talk about, and if you have any further questions, you can feel free to tweet at me or the Postman Twitter. Once again, those are, sorry, one second, let me change my Zoom chat. That's at Scottish Kilt or at Postman Client. We're always very happy to keep on talking about this functionality. So I hope that answered your question on dynamic running. And now we can go ahead and move on. If you do have any further questions, I'll pause for just a few seconds, and then we can talk about monitoring, which is another really awesome way to run our collections. Okay, looks like we don't have any other questions. So we've seen that we can, run these collections manually on our computer, but what if we aren't always at our computer and we want this to happen regularly? What if, I have a bunch of different patients that I need to send out reports to every so often, or I need to repeatedly check the Twitter API? Well, that's when functionality called monitoring pops up within Postman. So here we see this monitor over here. What is a monitor? A monitor is basically a collection run that occurs on the Postman cloud servers. So we can go ahead and either create a new API as we create a monitor, or we can use a collection. Say, let's use that tests and scripts collection that we were running earlier. We can decide to have an environment. And then here's something interesting. We can set a frequency. So we actually have the ability to specify even down to the hour or minute. So if we wanted to, within a week, we could tell, every weekday. We can specify certain days of the week. This is basically similar to, how Google Calendar might schedule something. And so we can tell it to run whenever at certain times. The granularity that we are able to achieve is, here with hours, you can sort of do 12, 6, 4, 3, 2, 1. And with minutes, you can actually do different times within the hour, so 30, 20, 15, 10, and 5. The power of this is that, if you have an API that you need to be constantly checking, then you can do that with Postman monitoring. The other piece of functionality that we do offer with monitoring is regions. So when you select regions, you might want to know if your Asia Pacific servers are functioning just as fast as your US West servers. And maybe this is an important piece of concern if you have a certain performant API. So you can select which regions you want things to run in, and you'll actually get individual reports on those. So if we go ahead and collect or create our, sorry, 1 second. If we go ahead and create our monitor, see it's running, and then you can actually go and look at your monitors in your dashboard. So let's go ahead and pop over to that dashboard and see what's up. Sorry, just 1 second. Here we go. So here's my personal workspace, and we want to look at our monitors. We can see that our test and script monitor is now showing up here. So it hasn't run yet. Let's tell it to run real quick. And this is sort of what our monitor running looks like. It's running right now, and then if we were to refresh, you can see that it's still starting up to run. So in the cloud, basically, you don't have as much granular control as you would in collection running. And the trade-off there is obviously that you get automation and you don't have to do any of your own internal infrastructure or setup like you would running things from the command line. So let's actually look at what a fully fledged monitor looks like when you've run it, when you've already run it. So here is a sample of what a monitoring page looks like when it's been running for a while. Here we can see sort of an old familiar friends that show us, this is what the collection runner looks like. It's showing us all our passes, all our fails. And you can also see console logs, which is something that we weren't able to see in the collection runner. So that's one awesome thing about monitoring, is that you are really, you're really empowered to figure out what went wrong and when it went wrong. The other thing you're seeing here is you're seeing basically the different tests that might have passed or failed, and when specifically they failed. This graph at the top is showing you your response times, and you can see different requests in different regions. And so those regions are selectable had you selected different ones, and you're able to actually move through these different reporting options. The final thing is, well, the request split is what you see when you layer all of your requests at once. So it sort of shows you, oh, we're getting spikes here, and these specific requests are taking longer than this bottom line, which is very fast. So looks like we've got a question in the chat. So we had a question about regions. Basically asking if Postman has servers in each of these regions. And yes, so we will send requests from each of those regions. Those servers are basically stationed in each of those places. We had another question, which is, we have a dev environment, which is internal network, and he's not able to run the test in the dev environment. So that's actually something that we'll be talking about right after this, which is running things from the command line. Okay, excellent. So if there are any further questions about monitoring, I'll leave those, just leave you a few seconds to talk about those. And then if not, we can go ahead and move on to Newman and command line running. Yep, so we had a restatement of our basically internal network monitoring. And monitors, so that is correct. Monitors, since they are hosted on the Postman cloud, if you're trying to run something on an internal private network that does not have access to the global internet or has restricted access, then no, you cannot use a Postman monitor to do this. We do have some options. For example, with Enterprise Postman, we have the ability to whitelist certain IPs. So if you do have, security concerns, that's one of our options. But generally, when it comes to running entirely on an internal network, that isn't currently something that we support with out-of-the-box functionality for Postman, which is why we're going to talk about some options in just a second about how you can get to them. Okay, cool. So we talked about how we can schedule with monitoring. We walked through those different analytics, the logs, and we saw that we can, drill down to requests, regions, dates, and look at the logs for our debugging. The one thing that we hadn't actually talked about is you can get notifications that will alert you about these test failures. We do allow you to configure email notifications, which are great for if you're a systems admin or someone in charge of the API. We actually, and we'll talk about this in a later webinar, offer different third-party integrations out of the box that will allow you to get Slacks or PagerDuty interactions just to see that how your monitors are doing or if they're failing. Now we're going to run through very quickly running your collections from the command line. We will have a more in-depth demo in the future, but that will involve the Postman API, and it will be part of a future webinar. So this is Postman Newman. Basically, it's our open source command line. This lets you run your collections locally, or you can host scripts on your server and run them in your CI, your continuous integration environment. So what you're seeing here is basically someone logging in and setting the individual parts of a request and then getting the responses from their tests. You can configure your collections normally as you would in the app and then decide to run them in Newman with command line. So you can run from URLs as well, for example, the URLs that you use to share collections, or you can run them from a path to your local collection file. And so, for example, to do that, you would just export your collection as JSON and then point Newman at it. Then you have a lot of different options to configure your collection run within Newman. And then you also are able to integrate into your CI environment. So this is if you're hosting on one of your internal servers, for example, like what we were talking about before, you can export your run results to either different JUnit or JSON files, and you can also introduce your own custom reporters. For example, a script that might send something to an internal email or might fire off something else based on a result. So this is a really powerful open source tool that we encourage people to use. There's a lot of information out there on it, and it is basically allows you to fully take control of your collection running. You have so many degrees of freedom here, and the trade-off here, whereas the trade-off for monitoring is that you don't have as much control at your fingertips, and the trade-off for Collection Runner is that you're not able to run when you're not there. The trade-off for Newman is that it does require a little bit of technical expertise and the ability to script. So what we will talk about in the future, and we did have a question about the Postman, basically about how we can use Newman to persist variables. Oh, and we had a comment in the chat that there used to be, you couldn't read system or environment variables set outside of Newman once Newman launched. And where the question is continuing, has that been improved upon? So, and that's sort of what we were about to talk about. In the future, we had you actually, as part of the setup for this webinar series, download a Postman API key. And I have a feeling that not everyone has one downloaded now. So this is just a quick reminder to go to your Postman dashboard and go ahead and, when you get the chance, pull down and get one of those API keys. So just to remind you how to do that, you can go into your workspace and you can go to integrations, click on Postman API. Here, I'll walk through that a little bit slower for you. So your workspace, the integrations tab, Postman API, and then click on Get New API Key. That's something that we'll be running next time, but basically, or sorry, not next time, but during our integrations webinar. Basically, with the Postman API, you can access all aspects of your workspace. You can say, I want to get this collection, I want to get this environment, even your monitoring and your mocks, pretty much everything that you see up here, you can access via the Postman API. There is documentation about that online. There is documentation about that online that will sort of walk you through how you can start setting up and using the Postman API. So the question about using Newman to persist internal variables is that we can actually combine Newman and the Postman API to dynamically access our environments as we are running Newman. And that is our suggested basically solution to using environments and dynamically changing them while you are working with Newman. The one caveat to this is that you cannot actually access the Postman API if you are working on an internal system. So if you want to do testing and use basically fixed environments or things that aren't dynamically active during your runs, then that Newman is perfect for your internal secure running. If you are trying to do stuff that's more dynamic, you need access to the Postman API and the Postman Cloud. So we had another question that was mentioned. I mentioned that we can integrate with other internal apps like email. Can you elaborate more on that, please? Really what I was referring to there is that if you happen to have an internal API or another script that you might want to fire as a result of a Newman result being created, then that is something that you could go ahead and do. However, that falls into the realm of external scripting with Newman. Like I said here, we will be walking through at a different point how to use Newman and the Postman API together. So thank you very much. Let me click through to our summary. If there are any other questions, I'll give you a second to talk about them here. But just to sort of go over what we've talked about before, in the Postman app, you can use the collection runner. In the command line, you can use Newman. And running collections in the cloud, you can use monitoring. And those are all of our different options for running collections. It's important to remember that collections run sequentially, but using that postman.setNextRequest and environments, you can get some more dynamic interaction. Obviously, when you run collections, you're really scaling up your Postman activity, and it's a way to really blast off into the stratosphere and take your testing or the API usage that you have currently with Postman and change everything. In the future, we'll talk about how that Postman API is able to access all of your data on the Postman cloud, and you can use it to start dynamically changing things with Newman and custom scripts. Thank you very much for attending the webinar. Next week, we'll be talking about communication. Please go ahead and register for that, and I'll see you guys then. I'll keep the line open for just a few minutes to receive any questions that you guys might still have. And please take the time, go ahead and play with some of this functionality, and please, write us, tweet at us, whichever channel you might want to access us, and send us some of your questions. Send us how you feel about all this collection running, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time. And we had a question about whether or not this video will be made available on YouTube. Yes, we really encourage you to go and look at our YouTube channel. We eventually post all of our webinars videos up there, and we also have other videos that go into all of this functionality more in depth. So we did have a question about basically adding delay to each request within a collection in testing scripts. That is something that I believe we do not have a current sandbox function for, but there are a lot of different options for how to do that within JavaScript as a scripting language. That's definitely something that I would sort of encourage some independent research about, and I'd be happy to talk about it privately as well. And so we have another question about capturing API requests with Postman. So the previous videos, or basically if we've talked about this in the past, or it will be covered in the future. I believe you're asking about the proxy feature, and that is something that we'll be covering in 2 webinars, which is when we'll talk about mocking, integrations, and utilities. So there are a lot of nooks and crannies in Postman, and that's one of the features that is really fun to use, but is often overlooked. So we'll be talking about that in 2 webinars. So we had another question about working, basically the workaround I mentioned with working in Newman to work on an internal network. I would encourage you to do a little bit of reading and check out our documentation and some of our videos on running Newman in Postman, or go ahead and tune in to our demo in just a few weeks to looking at how to use the Postman API. When you are working in a different environment within your internal network, Newman is pretty much your only option. Because you're not able to access Postman Cloud, or if that is your situation, you will have to manipulate things manually using Newman. So you basically just go ahead and tweet at me, or basically look at some of our documentation, check out our YouTube channel, and if you're still not seeing the information that you need, then we can definitely take that conversation offline. And I can go ahead and pull up that pointer for the Newman docs for you in just a second. It'll give me 2 minutes. Oops, sorry. So here is in the Zoom chat a piece of documentation on using Newman. So I would encourage you to read through this and look at all the different options and see if you are a fan of Newman and what you think you might be able to do with it. And we had another question about not seeing the tests and scripts webinar. So the webinars take a little bit to edit, turn around, and get back online. I would just keep on checking in with the YouTube channel, and we will have that video up eventually. In the meantime, there are a few other resources in our YouTube channel that I would encourage you to check out. There is a playlist that is either published right now or will be published very soon that will cover a lot of the topics that we are covering now in more concise videos. And we've actually published a link to the test and script webinar in the chat, so there you go. Go ahead and check it out. Awesome. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we've had for today. Once again, thank you guys so much for attending. It's always a pleasure to have you. And I'll see you next week for communication. We'll be talking about workspaces, documentation, and how to really start moving your collections around and working with teams inside of Postman.